I would say 10. You're live, Anna.
Hello, and welcome to the third in the Factum Foundation discussions of the new technologies and the preservation of the cultural heritage. We at the Art newspaper and our Italian sister paper, Il Giornale Dell'Arte, are very pleased to have had part in organising the discussions and providing the platform for them. The first discussion was essentially about questions to do with the original work of art and its facsimile. Essentially, what status do we give to the original and to its copy? The second discussion was about what you do with works of art, both original and facsimile, and what their role can be in communicating, preserving, and sharing the world's heritage. That was a political hot potato. Then today is the turn of geek is chic, as they say in the Science Museum. We're very lucky to have a panel made up of some of the greatest experts in big data as applied to the world of culture. And thank you everybody for agreeing to take part. And the subject of the discussion is an intimacy with the physical world, new technologies generating new knowledge. The conversation will be about big data and its malleability, searchability, and longevity, about the false dichotomy between analog and digital, and the possibilities of which most of us don't even have an inkling now. For as Sarah Kenderdine, who's on the panel, says, all the Montreux Jazz Festival can be stored in a single grain of sand and all the data of the world in a suitcase. Why? Digitalization may even come to the rescue of Venice, which is doomed by climate change unless government policies improve dramatically. And now here I shall hand over to Adam Lowe, the founder of Factum Foundation, which made their first famous facsimile in Venice, and since then have brought the science and art of digitalizing and reproducing works of art to the highest level. Thank you, Adam, for having involved us.
Thank you very, very much. It's a great privilege to have the panel we've got together tonight being chaired by, or this afternoon being chaired by Ian Blatchford from the Science Museum. And it's really next door to the Science Museum at Imperial College that our title comes from. So Patrick Blackett, who was the great experimental physicist who ran Imperial College between 1953 and 1963, was asked what an experimental physicist did. I sort of feel this is a kind of experimental panel talking about somehow this world between the digital, the physical, the analog, and the digital, somehow the material and the digital. So there's a sort of grey area that I hope we're going to navigate. But when Patrick Blackett was asked what an experimental physicist did, he said, well, basically, you know, I blow glass, but I could never earn a job as a glass blower. I fiddle around with electrics, but I could never wire someone's house. I do things with carpentry, but I could never be considered a woodworker. So he goes through a whole list of material things. And then he said, for the rest of my time, the final 5%, I cultivate an intimacy with the behavior of the physical world. And in a way, that's the backdrop. What I hope everyone who's going to talk tonight is going to reveal is that we're not only cultivating an intimacy with the behavior of the physical world, we're trying to understand how to archive that, how to record it, how to take hold of it, how to read it, how to respond to it. So I know very well some of the speakers tonight, and Frederick Kaplan and I work very, very closely with the Fondazione Giorgio Cini in Venice, as Anna just mentioned, where we've established something called Archive, which is the analysis and recording of cultural heritage in Venice. And Archive is really trying to do blue sky thinking. We're trying to do research without predetermined outcomes to actually shape and contribute to this debate. So at that point, I'm going to hand over to Ian. Ian, thank you very much, and over to you.
Well, thank you, Adam, and thank you, Anna, and it's a great pleasure to be chairing this. My plan of action is really to give each panelist time to breathe. So rather than dive into a great debate instantly, I want them all to spend a few minutes talking about some questions I've asked them to consider. and I will introduce them in turn rather than at the beginning. But I thought I would start by reflecting on the fact that I'm sure many of the people watching online are people who do digital work in museums and libraries. And I think they must find themselves in a rather astonished state of mind at the moment, because only a few years ago, their roles didn't exist. And then rather grudgingly, they became part of the museum and archive world. And they fought for years to be not just add-ons, but co-producers of content. And suddenly the understudy has become the star. And at the moment, their work is very much in the highlight. And I think a wonderful opportunity for something that I really hope we can achieve from this session. There are big theoretical, philosophical, and political issues around technology. But also, I suppose the leitmotif I would hope, particularly as this panel is so expert, is some serious pragmatism in terms of honesty about who this knowledge is for, which systems have been very successful and which not, and also quite difficult questions about the audience and collaboration. So what I'm going to do first is turn to Brian Cantwell-Smith, who is Reid Hoffman Professor of Artificial Intelligence and the Human in the Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto. And I wonder, Brian, if you can start us off big picture, because we live in the age almost of breathless wonder at artificial intelligence and machine learning. You have a distinguished record of tracking this phenomenon over many years with a high degree of sanity and good sense. So can you start us off with some big picture thoughts?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all of them. Yeah, I've actually been in AI for now over 50 years. And one of the things that's most impressive to me about the impact of computing and artificial intelligence on our understanding has actually been its disruption of the very categories in terms of which we understand our engagement, and in particular, our engagement with the physical world in terms of that intimacy. So on Friday, Neil McGregor was talking about 4 different Davids that have been constructed with different meanings and locations and so on. And I was struck, and I've been struck by this for many, many years, about how in music we have a Brahms quartet perhaps, and then we have performances of the Brahms by, you know, Juilliard, Emerson, whatever it is. And we have a sense of how we allocate the, you know, or an authenticity and so on between and among the composer and the performer. And Adam knows this, for who I've known for a long time. I have never felt that Adam was constructing replicas or copies or facsimiles. I've felt that what Adam is doing is performing things, performing physical objects. So performing the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, you know, a masterful performance of the Veronese wedding at Cana in Venice. And to cite something that of Proust that Mary Lending talked about on Friday, also rescuing concrete artifacts from the tyranny of the particular and allowing them to have a much bigger and broader life. And I think that's a really stunning adjustment of the physical world and our understanding of it. There are many other things about the physical that are changing. The idea of presence. You know, 20 years ago, I was kind of rocked back on my heels, because I was an old fogey already, by teenagers in Tokyo saying that they had been at a party the previous night, when it turned out that their form of being on there at the party was on Skype or FaceTime or whatever the technology of the day was. They didn't distinguish that from having been what you and I might think of as physically present. Now, that doesn't seem so strange to us now in the era of COVID 20 years later, but there's still challenges. I have colleagues talking to young immigrants, of which Toronto has many. A lot of the digitally born have a very different sense of geography and proximity in virtue of these technologies. Other things, other ideas and understandings that they've changed. The notion of publishing, obviously, perhaps the most obvious one that's been disrupted and reconfigured. The whole distinction between the physical and the virtual, which is, I think by now, as we were saying, I think that's pretty much gone, but that's also untenable. But think about digitality has nothing to do with 2 dimensions. And I kind of think history will laugh at us. I mean, we're, you know, bloody amateurs and alchemists with respect to this transformation. When we talk about a virtual museum exhibit, everyone thinks it's going to be on a screen. But why is it that we associate digitality with 2 dimensions? I think that's going to be curious to people in another century and so on. And I don't know if anybody thinks of Adam's tombs as virtual, because they're so I don't think the category of virtue actually, let alone virtual, are necessarily applicable. And one of the things, just one final example that I've spent a lot of time on, is the very idea of intelligence itself and artificial intelligence. I think Sarah may talk about the relationship, a useful distinction she makes between artificial intelligence and intelligence augmentation. I am actually wondering about the notion of intelligence itself and whether that doesn't have to be unbundled into different components. So one distinction I make is between a kind of calculative reckoning that I think these systems are fabulous at, quite possibly better than us. And I think, in fact, it may already be unethical for a doctor to rely on their own human abilities to detect patterns or to read x-rays and so on and so forth. That's an aspect of intelligence that I think the machines will do better. On the other hand, there are existential, ethical, committed, humane, compassionate understandings that I think of being part of human judgment that I don't think anything envisaged in AI, not only the last 50 years, but probably in the next 50 years is actually going to touch. And how we're going to allocate skills across that. What is it that we want to nourish and encourage in people? What is it we want to allocate to machines and stuff? These are fundamental questions that I think have to be addressed. So I got to close with Richard Curran last night was saying the rise of electricity really changed our understanding and categories. And of course, writing did the same. My concern as we start moving into concrete practicalities is that we not analyze tomorrow's prospects and perils and so on and so forth by unwittingly relying on yesterday's conceptual schemes. I think the conceptual schemes themselves are in fact being reconfigured and disrupted by these technologies.
Well, thank you. That's great. And there's so many questions there that I'd like to pursue with you and others, particularly also questions about objectivity with new technologies. We'll come back to that, but I think one of the questions that lurks in the background of all these sessions is the power of actually who's deciding categories and knowledge, but we'll come back to that maybe. I want to turn next to a theme that really fascinates me about these new technologies. With museum and library and archive people have a very particular view of the past, which is for us, the past is totally alive and in constant interplay with the present and the future. And I think one of the fascinating things about new technologies is the degree to which they are completely liberating the past in an astonishing way. Now, all the panel can talk about that, but I think our next expert is a particularly fine example of that, which is Frederick Kaplan, Professor of Digital Humanities at the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne. And particularly the Venice Time Machine, I think, is a wonderful example of a vast, impenetrable archive suddenly alive in a way that is almost beyond comprehension. I wonder, Frederick, if you can talk about what you've been achieving.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and it's a pleasure to be on the panel. I think the Venice Time Machine started in 2012 with a shock. I mean, the shock of seeing the materiality of the archive. I mean, kilometers of documents in corridors, endless corridors. I mean, millions of photographs, and really the sensation that there was too much material to actually study it in a normal manner. I mean, a bit like if you had the feeling that it was like a task that would never be, possible to complete. And we thought, what can we do? Of course, we should digitize. We should be capable of extracting and linking this information. And we tried to show that it was possible on some scale to do this with, as a first step, a desire that would have been, I think, very normal for any normal internet users of today. It would be to have like a search engine in which you could just search for a word and find all the mention of that particular person in the documents, or search for a particular pattern on an image and see, where in the millions of photographs which are currently in Venice, that pattern would occur. So maybe I can just show you, do a small demonstration of our current prototype so that you see a bit where we were, where we are, and we could talk later about what are the potential even future prospects about this. Let me switch to this. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So let me, for instance, this is a prototype search engine we made. Here I'm searching the name Tiepolo. I would find actually some metadata about Tiepolo on the different images that were digitized, particularly the Cini Foundation. But I can also, through the progress of handwritten recognition, search inside a document which have been either annotated manually or actually read by the machine. For example, that particular document was only read by the machine. And I can see that Tiepolo here in this Somarioni, it's not the painter in that case, it's one member of his family, was actually owning a small place in Venice near Campo Santa Manuel. And this information was all there. I mean, nothing new, nothing really fancy, just connecting information from the past, from existing administrative systems, unpacking it and making it, let's say, as smoothly and as dynamically usable like other information on the internet. If I search, for instance, for San Marco, I would find, of course, information about various representation of the sand, but I can also have one of the various representation of Piazza San Marco, and then I can search now visually. I mean, not looking for any textual symbolic content, but just looking from a visual perspective using deep learning technique. And I found, of course, dozens of representation of Piazza San Marco from the same point of view. And some are photographs, some are engravings, some are ancient, some are more recent. And I can pick one of those. You see, I mean, they're very different from a picture point of view, but they actually represent the same perspective. Now I say, okay, if I want to focus on the company or detail on this, and forget to some extent about that particular perspective, then I can use similar techniques to search and look for that particular pieces of architecture and see whether I'll find maybe other representation of the Campanile of San Marco from other perspective potentially. And you see that here we've been relaxing to some extent the search, having a different perspective on the same views and from different perspectives. Of course, you could do that with paintings. You can look for a particular pattern on the painting and start immediately to have a lot of latent connections. None of these connections were actually made by any human curator. I mean, they are latent in the data and just waiting to be discovered. And last type of interface I wanted to show you is that sort of global curation interface that permits to progressively recreate a model of a city. Here we are in Venice in 1808 and based on the Napoleonic cadastres. And now I will switch actually my small sliders and go back to a situation which is closer to the present and see how that particular part of Venice has evolved. And you see, of course, you can control that on another document like the satellite imagery and have progressively, I mean, like a global curation, a map, which is now a 4D map, which can be used almost like any other map, except that it has this temporal dimension and integrates this collective construction. So these are type of small change if you think about, I mean, the type of technology we're talking about here compared to what you have in that's it. You see my screen? Yeah.
Yeah. So Frederick, can I ask you an immediate question? I mean, the project is mesmerizing. And one of the things that fascinates me is how you can take the record of, for example, one merchant and through the incredible records in the Venetian archive, map their entire social network. Absolutely astonishing. I suppose my question is, can you say a little, though, about how people might use this knowledge? I mean, who do you think are the users for this? And is that something you started with a clear idea on, or have you sort of evolved the sense of how this is going to be a resource?
Well, I think we clearly started with the idea that there were not enough persons in curations or in librarian or in historian to actually study the amount of data that are there. I mean, one of the paradox we have is that, I mean, many of these connections have been actually found by the computer, just waiting to be seen by a single human being. And so we are taking a very large approach. So of course, I mean, the initial interest starts from art historians, Venetian scholars, urban historians, etc. But very rapidly, if you link, for instance, with genealogy, I mean, you linked with your particular family tree, maybe progressively, I mean, you find linked with your particular families. Or if you start with a very notion of place by your own street, I mean, your own calle, or your own building, and then first interest immediately sparks because it's not dealing anymore with representation of history. It starts with you, with your direct neighborhood, with the places you are going every day. And on that basis, you get the possibility of having also some form of expertise, including some form of knowledge, which is not the knowledge which is in libraries or in archive, but which corresponds to much more local knowledge about some information about who was there in that particular building at that time, how some word of mouth has spread, etc., etc. So we are really wishing to have this as an extended resources to show that the past and that depth, let's say, of the present can be with any decision, each of us, and be used in different ways for making good decisions politically, architecturally, but also having a richer life.
It is also, by the way, a wonderful story about breathtaking Venetian record keeping. We tend to think, don't we, of the modern age as being wonderful, but the Venetians put us to shame. I should warn the general viewer that actually the problem with the Venetian Time Project is utterly addictive. So go into it at your peril because it's so extraordinary. Can I turn to one of your colleagues, also in Lausanne, Sarah Kenterdine, who's Professor of Digital Museology. And Sarah, you have an amazing record of digital projects in different scales, but also in many different countries. And you seem to have crashed through many cultural barriers to achieve some rather extraordinary results. I think it'd be wonderful both for me and for our listeners to know a little more about what you think has been interesting in recent years in terms of highs and lows of new technology.
Thank you, Ian. I might ask Nicholas to put on this slide that I prepared for this. That would be great. So I am indeed a creator of experimental installations for museums. You could say big cultural data for big machines. These are performative interfaces, if you like. And one of the most interesting aspects is the way in which digital data is so malleable. And one way to highlight this or to show an example is to look here at a project for the World Heritage Site of the Donghuan Caves, Cave 220 in China. Donghuan was the nexus of the Silk Road, 492 caves, 45,000 square meters of mural paintings, and over 2,500 statues in size and breadth like nothing else in the Chinese Buddhist world. Each cave takes about 3 months to digitize. And we created 5 distinct works out of a single data set, using different ways of seeing the panoramic, the hemispheric, the augmented. The panoramic 360 3D version that you see, it's on the top row of this slide. These 2 images, it's 10 meters across, 4.5 meters high. It allows about 30 people at any one time, a one-to-one scale experience of being inside the cave. And it uses a range of recoloring, animation, magnifying tools as strategies of engagement. In the augmented reality version that you see on the 2 slides on the bottom row, on the left-hand side of this image, we're using 24 infrared cameras, and visitors are walking inside the digital model, again at one-to-one scale. It's like a window on the world, if you like. It's a highly social interface that is shared amongst many people, single user, multi-spectator, and also very multi-generational. I think that's one of our responsibilities, is that digital experiences are not confined to the young, but transcend all ages if they're well built. And on the remaining slide on the bottom right-hand side, we see a full dome image. The curvature of the dome itself emulates the pyramidal architecture of K220 in a kind of hemispheric gestalt. And these are just 3 of the 5 different installations we created from a single data set, and they've been seen by millions of people now around the world, while the real cave is permanently closed to the public, which is an important point. These works also often accompany major object shows. So Adam likes to talk about the migration of aura. I talk about a proliferation of aura. And I really enjoyed your commentary, Adam, where you talk about how a recorded copy can be both a load of forensically accurate information and a vehicle for evoking deep emotional responses. And that's what these digital experiences do. They're not infobytes for the real thing. They are profound and affecting experiences in their own right. Ian, you asked me earlier about the recoloring of mural paintings and also about animation. I think using pigment studies and scientific analytic processes that recoloring has a role to play. But I would say animation is in a different realm altogether. And if we're talking about sins in museums, sin number one is trying to animate a great painting. Because as we know, great paintings are already animated. Sin number two, since we're on to sins, sin number two is taking the public into museological space, which is the place of civic seeing, of socialization, and putting them into the head-mounted display or the so-called VR goggles. I think this is highly antisocial and is counter-narrative to one of the main purposes of the museum. I also, you mentioned that there can be successes and failures in all of this work in experimental museology, which is what I do. And I don't really subscribe to failure rhetoric in that way. I think the processes of bringing these experiences into the world is always the unexpected pleasure of the way in which the public engage, appropriate, and change the works that are built. And that reminds me of the Homi Bhabha's post-colonial theorist. He talks about culture as an insurgent act of cultural translation, and what our job is to provide the framework in which this can take place using new digital tools. If we quickly jump on, I'll just highlight a couple of other aspects of the work we do. Nicholas, if we change the slide, that would be great. So in 2007, museums changed their definition to be able to collect intangible cultural heritage. And while people are busy making lists and catalogs and inventories, what are the digital strategies that we can use to capture or archive something which is living? It's the most difficult, I would say, of all of the archival modes. And I've been working extensively since 2012 with 33 elite Kung Fu masters and whose repertoires are under threat from increasing globalization and other pressures. And we do something called whole of environment encoding, lots of motion capture, 3D video, 360-degree video, in an attempt to provide modes of transmission for their repertoires. And it's really a bit of a green field for the digital cultural world to work on these documentation pipelines, but also to figure out the strategies for bringing this into the museum context. Here you can see in these slides pose matching, motion analytics, a lot of 3D stuff, and in the round viewing. The performance theorist Diana Taylor talks about how embodied and performed acts generate, record, and transmit knowledge. And that's what we need to build inside the museum to support this repertoire. And if we just jump to the final slide, great. I am very interested in the convergence of collecting organizations, archives, libraries, museums, and so on. And in 1889, the curator from the Smithsonian, G.B. Good, said, he delivered a lecture called The Future of the Museum, and he said the future of the museum the future museum would stand side by side with the library and the laboratory. And it's this convergence that is interesting. It's also perhaps sin number 3, that museums are not experimenting enough, because that's what this statement that Good made implies. With digital and with classification, we've got ourselves into a situation of database logic, you know, where users transform physical assets of cultural organizations into digital assets, uploaded, downloaded, visualized, shared. Users who treat institutions as storehouses, not as storehouses for physical objects, but rather as data sets to be manipulated. And what really interests me is how we revise these mechanistic descriptions and replace them by ways in which computation is experiential, spatial, materialized, embedded, and embodied. And I think this is where AI has a great deal to offer, and also I call it IA, intelligent augmentation. Humans in the loop is also something that I think is very important here. The slides refer to a project we just completed called Jazz Luminaries. It's a social network diagram that you see on the right-hand side. It's 5,400 artists. They are linked by the number of times that they played together. So it's a social network based on how many times they played together. At the center of the universe is B.B. King. And you lie under the full dome on an inflatable poof, and you're able to surf 13,000 videos that result from this constellation. You're using this spherical interface in a mode of searching which is not text and knowing what you're looking for, but searching by listening. It's like tuning a radio and then going into the materials further into the database. The Montreux Jazz has 11,000 hours of video, memory of the world object, if you like, or archive. And EPFL conducted a really great test with Twist from LA, where they encoded 2 songs into DNA, synthetic DNA, Smoke Over the Water by Deep Purple and Miles Davis's Tutu. And what that means is that you can encode into synthetic DNA, you can de-encode and listen to these 2 songs at the museum at EPFL, but it means that the entire archive of 11,000 hours can be stored in a grain of sand. It means that the entire data of the world can be stored in a single suitcase. And this also initiates a radical shift about how we think about archival and retrieval practices in museums, libraries, and archives, and a radical repositioning in the transmission of objects in time and space.
Wow, thank you. I certainly want that suitcase with the history. And
yeah, exactly.
Can I have first right to take that? There were many references there to one of the fascinating aspects of new technology, which is actually libraries. And we're just about to turn to someone who really knows that subject brilliantly. I'm very fascinated by this because if I take my own museum as being fairly typical, we have 7.5 million things. It's the largest and most important science collection in the world. But of the 7.5 million things, only 350,000 are objects, as in 3D things. And 99.9% of our digital effort is about them, not about the archival material. At which point I think I need to, having made that confession, I need to turn to someone who I think will have a great perspective on this, because so often when you talk to digital directors, they say libraries and archives have been doing some of the most interesting work. So Carol Mandel is Dean Emerita of New York University Libraries. And Carol, you must have a fascinating perspective on how technology has changed the nature of how you reach the world.
Well, it certainly has. And what I want to do is maybe just give the tiniest background overview and then talk about some of the challenges we're facing now, because we just never have this licked. We just keep working it through. So today we've been seeing, and through the series, digital technologies that can produce the materiality of artifacts. Libraries and their users have enjoyed the benefit of digital technologies that can at least reproduce the content back to the archives of artifacts for more than 2 decades. And that's been quite transformative. It didn't take creative scholars very long to recognize what even the most rudimentary digital technology could do for their work. My own first experience of digital revelation actually came in the mid 1990s. I had the opportunity to work with a team of papyrologists, technologists, and librarians, led by my colleague then at Columbia, Roger Bagnall, because he was creating, with a lot of colleagues, the Advanced Papyrological Information System, APIS. And what APIS, was a papyrologist's dream, because here were all these scattered fragments and collections around the world, and you could scan them and bring them together and then understand them in ways you never had been able to do. And I think what's interesting, of course, is that that's a database created 25 years ago, but continuing to be add-on, enriched, explored in new ways. And I want to get back to that theme in a minute. So by the early years of our current century, the real pleasure of being a librarian through that whole digital transformation was seeing readers' glee at being freed from the shackles of microfilm, being given so much content, just anything you could imagine suddenly, increasingly made available, where there were profits to be made. Publishers were selling them to us and we were buying them. And then there was more things being digitized in other ways. And it was just an extraordinary experience for everyone. And that was, all of 15 years ago or so. Sorry, the papyrology was 25. And now, of course, we take access to that content entirely for granted. We just assume it, expect it. But we do keep developing new tools for interrogating it. It keeps being added to, it keeps being looked at in new ways. The larger it gets, the more you need new techniques for understanding it, like the Venice Project and what we've been talking about. I was fascinated to see Sarah's exhibits with the Dunhuang Caves, because that was a digital, early digital project. Bill Bowen at Mellon became just obsessed with the Dunhuang Caves. And so there's a digital record, again, made in those early days, but look at the new life she's given it. So it keeps going. It's wonderful. A big excitement for me in that digital development period was when we had technology that really could appropriately and adequately at preservation level reformat audio and photographic, video, audio material, because that is material that just has no lifespan. You can just watch that magnetic tape shed right before your very eyes. It is not going to live. So digital reformatting was its only hope. Talk about what's real and what's the artifact, and so now all of this content can be rescued. There's still many projects going on, but we've digitized enormous amounts of content. I think the British Library has that Save Our Sounds project across the UK that's so important. And then once, of course, it's been digitized, it's viewable by anybody, anywhere. So it's brought out into the open and again, can be interrogated in ever new ways. And so much of that newly available AV content is cultural heritage material, oral histories, traditional performance, spoken words from languages that are dying out. In fact, it was a pleasure to hear Sarah also mention my colleague Diana Taylor in performance, because she got me started collecting. We have a whole, she and I worked on this Latin American performance video archive before there was even YouTube. We were inventing how to do this. It was great. But the technology gets better and better and more pervasive, and you do new things with it. The thing is also that the digital technologies become so simple to use that it gives communities the power to archive their own culture. So community archiving is happening now. I'll get into my worries about that, because then where is all this going? But you've got intangible cultural heritage being made tangible, then being made virtual. And by the fact that it's virtual, it's open to whole new modes and depths of understanding and learning. So I do have to say that in the midst of all this digital resurrection, all this new knowledge and all this new work, I do have to bring up another kind of digital transformation. Brian talked about digital disruption. And I want to spend a few minutes on the disruption being caused by content that is born as digital and where this may be going. And as a background to that, I need us to think about evidence and memory. We know our stories come in many forms. We're telling them in many forms newly. They come in many forms. I really like David Levy's definition of a document as a talking thing. And anything that can tell you something, whether it's a fossil or it's a film, this gets us into the conversations we might have about museums and libraries and what kinds of talking things we all have. And consider some of the forms that talking things have started now to take in the last decade of born digital content. What's been introduced? Of course, we have digital equivalents of the photograph, digital photographs. We have digital recordings. We have ebooks. Now we have the extraordinary products of digital scholarship. And I think that's exactly what the Venice Project is, what everything that Factum is doing. These reproductions are really digital scholarship. And then they result in digital content that is born digital. But there are really now ever more ways that we give evidence to our lives and to this world. The story of this pandemic will be told in Facebook pages, in memes, in tweets, in endless streaming news, in constantly updated versions of public health websites. In this extraordinary time, there are some special archiving initiatives underway to capture this. But normally, these kinds of streams of content actually continue to fall outside the routine collecting of most memory institutions. We're so interested in what digital can do for the past that we're ignoring our digital present. Consider personal documents. Those old postcards and diaries and photo albums rescued from attics and brought to libraries by the great-great-grandchildren and by which we write history. I ask you where your Facebook page and your iPhone photos will be in 75 years. Not every historic moment is recognized in its own time. Sadly, we're in a moment that you can't help but recognize, although there may be things about it that we can't perceive now, that we're not capturing, but we have to consider how fleeting and fragile born digital content is. We have to think about that long view of historic insight, the things that we recognize only centuries later that we want to understand and know about. And then we can go back and try to find records of. Well, for goodness sake, I'm talking to people like archaeologists. So think of all the things that we learn because we look back. Will we have the digital records to probe? So we in society, and I mean society very large, need to help our memory institutions make some very radical changes in our modes of operation, in our collaborations with each other, and with partnerships we've not had before, except maybe when we're begging for money. For example, where is most of our digital evidence held? In the hands of proprietary big tech. That's where it is. So if we don't find new ways to work with them, where will that be? The Venice Project reminds us that time is the fourth dimension. Born digital is the past of the future. Will it be there? That's what keeps me up at night.
Wow. Ashley's going to keep me up at night now.
I hope so. That was my goal.
No, and great questions. No, I was thinking about your task earlier because a few years ago, the Science Museum did an exhibition that was wildly popular on the life of Alan Turing. And one of the great things in the exhibition were the incredible, unbelievably intimate letters he wrote to his friends. That culture doesn't really exist anymore. And the 2020 Alan Turing lives on social media. But also a question you raised there, which I think links to our final speaker, is really that in the end, it does come back to a lot of human judgment and skill sets of those who work in museums and libraries. And I wonder if I can turn to William Owen, who's founder of Made by Many, because William is a very interesting mix in all of this, a man obviously with a great sympathy for the cultural world we're talking about, but also an entrepreneur. So very used to developing new products and prototyping them, and also having some ideas of what tends to succeed and what doesn't succeed. So William, can I turn to you for a breath of fresh air in terms of a commercial perspective on this? You need to unmute.
Always get caught. Good. Okay. That was very interesting to listen to Carol and also Brian earlier talking about radical change, and I think that it's worth recognizing that the kind of conversation that we've been having over the last 3 days and the level that it's been at in terms of the jobs that people do, it's actually quite unusual, and it's very welcome that that everyone's focused on digital technology as an opportunity to change and extend the role of museums at a time when their conventional role is disrupted, to the point where, right now at least, it's untenable, and it may face big challenges for a long period in the future. I'm not sure that technology is the challenge here, though. It's actually the easy part. The challenge is changing a mindset that's been formed for, let's say, 250 years and more, and it's been locked into the focus on the conservation of objects in storehouses and great displays and exhibitions, which have become gathering places and the pivot of many of our conversations about culture. So I think it's important to acknowledge that the priority of our museums has not been on the dissemination of data about those objects, and which, if they have it, are held in separate islands of data as well at the moment. And this seems to be the shift that we're talking about. We have to gather in new ways as people together and share data and ideas in new ways to generate new knowledge, which is the topic that we're talking about today. So this isn't a small change, it's actually a great disruption. And it's one that in the commercial world, in many sectors, we've started to become familiar with, and the challenges that they create for organizations. It means for museums, actually quite a shocking new set of priorities for museum trustees and senior management teams to start to think about. And certainly in Western museums, which value marble halls and great galleries before digital recording or distribution or tools for collaboration. And in particular, we might need to shift our focus from the role of the museum, which has been talked about a lot over the last 2 days. What's the role of the museum? What's the role of the object? What are the needs of the collections within it? To actually the role of our different audiences and what they need to achieve. And I think this is where we will need to start to question our conceptual framework, as Brian was talking about. Now, the interesting part of this is, though, that this situation isn't caused just by COVID-19. The disruption's been coming a long time. Factum has been at the forefront of this movement. So has the New York Public Library. So has the Science Museum Group in many ways. And one example is the recent initiative in Britain to create a single digital catalogue of the national museums, which a lot of new money has been put into, was not begun because of COVID-19. The virus has simply concentrated our minds. And until now, however, we have been taking baby steps. Digital has been around in museums for 10, 15 years now, but how will we look back on it 20 years hence is an interesting question. We have done very, very little. And so I think the big question that we've got to address, not necessarily today, but it would be good if we made a start in some ways as a panel and as an audience, is what does it mean for the museum sector to move from an industrial to a digital age? What kind of changes have to be made in terms of the capabilities of museums, their role and what they do, and how in particular they work with their audiences, who have often in the past been expected to come and gawp and wonder at the displays we put on, and instead start to be able to participate as makers themselves. So I think this is the big and urgent question that we need to start to think about.
Can I ask you one question before what I'm going to do in a moment is actually go to the general audience, because with this wonderful panel, I of course have them all on speed dial and can ask them any questions at any time. And I don't want to waste the opportunity for our general listener, but can I just ask you one question, William, which is one of the things that's, or a comment really, you alluded to it, which is one of the big things that's happening in the UK and also Europe, is actually from nowhere astonishing amounts of money heading in the direction of museums as part of the whole knowledge economy idea. In a way, I feel ambivalent about it. And I feel ambivalent about it because I'm not sure what it's all for. And whether actually some more fundamental questions might be asked at the beginning. One has this image of vast amounts of material being digitized with no particular end in mind. And I just wondered, from your point of view, with a commercial lens, how you feel about these great resources, because all museums are very good at making funding applications. And it's a wonderful thing, but also a bit of a trap. I mean, how do you feel about this next decade of investment?
Well, I agree with your dilemma, I suppose. I can see your dilemma insofar as, yes, it is a lot of money, and it could disappear quite quickly into a huge number of different research institutions or museums. And I think if you take a national catalogue as an example, I think the first interesting question is, what's a catalogue for? We as museums have created catalogues out of the legacy of their acquisition lists, their accession lists, the documents they use for insurance purposes and to assess the condition of their objects. And as a almost incidental byproduct, they become the public-facing catalogues of museums, as if something made for the museum is something that's useful to anyone else. And I don't know that that's necessarily true. And I think also that it's a question of where do you begin is the one that museums always have trouble with. And sometimes the answer is, well, we'll start at A and we'll work through to Z. And there's the assumption they have to do everything. And what we do when we go into a client in the commercial world is we look for value. And I don't necessarily mean commercial value. I mean, this might be, I'm here, cultural value. Which are the things that are particularly valuable? How do we understand that? We need to look at the audience and what they need. And we need to think about how we can apply it, whether it's technically feasible to do it, and how can we deliver it in a way that people need to have it. We don't just go, right, do everything, let's do everything. And I do fear that that might be the approach that's taken, because that's how museums are used to working. And they're facing a very new set of conditions with many levers to pull and many variables that are changing. And to deal with those, you need to have a different kind of approach. You can't solve those questions in committee. You have to make things. And that's not quite the same as research. It's sort of an active research and make and learn and test is the only way to start to understand what the new world looks like. And I do fear that large research projects will happen and they will be delivered, and then people will cogitate and make decisions in committees somewhere, and then possibly nothing will happen, or the wrong thing will be made. We shall see.
Wonderful to be so provocative. Now, the moment you dared to attack the holy grail of the museum catalogue, which we all learn to bow before every morning, I could see some of the panel keen to make some comments. And maybe I'll just go to a couple of those before we go to the general listener to this. If I can go to Brian and then Carol on the holy grail of the catalogue.
Well, I just wanted to say that in the mid 1990s, basically, when I was in Silicon Valley and stuff, there was a huge number of people and a huge amount of effort who thought the only way to make the internet useful to the world was to construct a catalog of it. And that was just the wrong idea. And in a way, what Google did was to say, forget the catalog. That's not the right form of intelligibility that this thing will have. So I just want to put that there as an example of something.
I think Carol's agreeing with you, I sense.
I do want to just before I jump to that revelation, which I agree totally, back around in the 1980s, libraries shifted from the concept of the catalog. We used to refer to bibliographic control. Right. We all took courses. I was a cataloger. We all knew about bibliographic control. And that, I even wrote an article about how we had to change that language to bibliographic access. And now that's the phrase that's used. And now, though, we've gone so beyond that because we're trying to look at ways to literally blow up the catalog, because we know that users come in, just as Brian said, from the internet. And so we're trying to figure out how to take all that content and send it out to the world, because that's the way they're going to come in to find it. So here we go.
Now, we've been talking a lot about the world out there, but the world out there is listening. So at this point, can I go to Lizzie Mitchell from Factum, who I know has been monitoring trending questions. Lizzie, perhaps you can dive in with some questions for the panel.
Yes, hi, Ian. So one question from Neil van der Linden, who's asking about the role of artificial intelligence in museums of the future. And he asks whether we can imagine AI as the curator, interactive library and interface between artworks and the audience. And I guess I wonder how far off that is.
I'm going to go to Brian, perhaps first on that.
Well, I think I think the first thing that has to happen is the concept of curator has to be blown up into constituents. It's just too blocky a notion. So there are lots of things that the computer will be able to do. I mean, I think my sensibilities are probably not unlike Sarah's here. So here's an example I use. Suppose you want to hire a robot as a babysitter, and you specify all of the tasks that you'd like the babysitter to do and the things to do and not do, and then you come back on 3 days later and say, "Where's my kid?" And the robot says, "Well, I don't know. I haven't seen it for a few days, but I did everything you said." It's one of the things about human judgment is that its commitment is to the situation itself, not to any data. You don't want the babysitter to take care of the data about the baby. You want the babysitter to take care of the baby. And at the moment, we don't know what it would be to construct AIs that are committed to the world as opposed to the data about the world. And there's a huge gap between the data and the world. And that's, I mean, this is why this is philosophy. This is why, this is an epistemic change as big as the beginning of the scientific revolution and so on and so forth. So I think just like, I mean, radiology is not a bad example. I would recommend to the person who asked about the curation. I think it's pretty clear that some things the AI will be able to do with respect to reading x-rays, and some things like whether, in fact, if you're 79 and your partner is 83 and you've got a cancer and there's a 14% chance that if you do 3 years of chemo, you'll last 4 years longer, but the next 2 years will be wrecked, whether, in fact, it's a good idea for you to do chemo and stuff, that's not a data question. There's humanity, compassion and stuff in there. And so I think the trick is, what's going to be the allocation of labor between those things that AI can do and the human judgment of the real creator as to what matters, what's held sacred, what will actually be important, and all of this kind of stuff. That the role for human judgment is not going away. It's not going to be replaced. And in fact, I think those of us in universities need to dedicate university education to encouraging real judgment in the students, and say, forget the stuff that the computer reckoners can do. Don't learn that. Don't bother learning that. Think about the real problems that, in fact, the people are going to have to continue to be stewards of, because those are the things that matter.
Something like that wants to come in, but before that, just staying on that just briefly, Brian, I think it's very interesting if I ask, as I've done, let's say 20 eminent cancer doctors, they make a very clear distinction between a task and a judgment. So they would all say, with absolute confidence, they would trust AI to do the cancer test accurately. But that is one task they trust, but then the judgment actually becomes even clearer. In fact, what's very interesting about AI is human judgment becomes in ever sharper focus, its strengths and weaknesses. that's just a comment. Can I come to Frederick? What's your view on this question?
Well, I think I follow up on Brian, but insist on the type of superpower, I mean, the AI is given. And I think we can summarize it at least to two big categories. And one is the massiveness of the extraction that AI permits. I mean, to give a concrete example, at the Cini Foundation, we've been digitizing using a wonderful scanner that was built by Adam, a big part of all the photographic that were there. And so we're talking about millions of photographs. An art historian, or maybe have seen, or is 30,000 or something like that. So if it's someone who just concentrated his life on this. So you have a situation where, I mean, the evidences, I mean, have been seen or at least analyzed by the algorithm in orders of magnitude larger. And then one would say, okay, what's the point? Maybe because if they cannot judge or if they cannot actually find the right things. But the thing which is interesting is that what come out in terms of the automatic connections which are found like that are example of sub-conceptual element. Again, we take one of the term that Brian liked to use. I mean, it's for instance, finding a pattern which has migrated over this millions of photographs, which is in itself a daunting task. It's daunting because not only you need to analyze, but because also the pattern itself does not have a name. It's not a concept. It's not something which has been identified. Something which is clearly there, which is unfolding the history of this document, because that small woman, which is drawn there, that you find back in that particular other painting and that third one. I mean, this means that there is a causal, historical relation between these data sets, and that has been found by the machine, and that needs to be then named. So there's all this, what I call the dark matter of history. I mean, all this graph of information that's just waiting for one human mind to have a look at it, to put it back in human knowledge. And that's essentially the preparation of this that AI can do. And in that sense, it will help, of course, curators. It will also help many persons which did not have the chance of having 30,000 pictures in their head to actually play that game and start curating altogether.
Your comment there, I wonder if I can ask Carol a question inspired by your comment. Carol, do you think that one of the issues for our profession is that if you look at the power of AI, what Frederick's describing is the amazing ability to find patterns and connections in a way that actually, at the heart of our profession, is a great belief in connoisseurial excellence, that actually only we somehow, after years of training, can find those connections. But actually, surely the Venice Time Machine project is illustrating that actually we're probably wrong about that to a large degree. And isn't that something that we're really, really struggling to get our minds around?
Well, when you say we, I think librarians are more humble about that. I think that we are a little more data and document driven. And the trend now, very recently, and actually I just was doing kind of a review that related to this. I've seen how much work, for example, the British Library, among others, has done on looking at collections as data and helping scholars. Now they have so much digitized content that they're creating whole programs. They're creating APIs for people to work with things. They're inviting scholars and residents. They have entire programs of collection analysis, collections as data. And this, of course, now can include images as well, and maps and all kinds of things that it's not just, OCR and text analysis, although that gets richer and richer and richer with, scientific development. So I think that that's a wonderful model for museums. It still requires the curators to have selected what ought to be there, or what merits the kind of care that museums give. But the understanding and patterns and what you can do with it, I think curators ought to be excited about the new things that people can do with what they have so beautifully selected and cared for.
They ought to be excited. You said that with the most wonderful and charming menace, Carol. Someone who obviously knows a great deal about patterns is Adam, given his work. I wonder if I can bring Adam in at this point.
No, I should really let everyone keep talking, but there's one point I'd love to make to take up what Carol just said, which is that we've run a project which Frederick was part of at Archive at the Cini Foundation with OCR. So some data sets need to be recorded at high resolution. So the project was done by Rashmi Gajare, looking at OCR reading Sanskrit texts of different musical notations. And basically, you don't necessarily need high resolution data to read text, but you do, as Frederick knows very well, need the resolution if you're reading images, because you don't want to be reading the pixels, you want to be reading it. So one of the things that has been going on in the background is everyone talking about recording and digitization, but digitization is not a blanket. I mean, so it's not one thing. So, I mean, you know, we 3D scan, we do composite photography, we do infrared, we do whatever. There's many, many ways of extracting information from an object which are needed by the people who are working with that object. So sort of in the way that Carol, I love Carol's answer about being much more humble than museum people in archives. I mean, part of my goal is to, you know, when I was younger going to museums, they were amazing places and they still are. But archives were largely overlooked and thought of as dusty. Actually, they're the new frontier. They're stuffed with information that if only we can get it out, there's a whole new future. And I think that's the excitement of the Venice Time Machine. That's what Frederick's got his finger on. And in a way, what's happening at Archive, at the Cini Foundation, is we're trying to get more and more data. The more data that's available, the better the analysis. The better the analysis, the bigger the implications, and the more you'll all see what's possible.
I'm going to turn to William, who I know wants to speak, but I just want to savor that wonderful phrase you just used, which is archives of the new frontier. What a fantastic phrase. I think the other thing I'm going to make specially for Carol and ship it over to the States is a big badge saying librarians rock, because clearly that's one of the key themes here. But William, what's your view on this?
Well, I think AI comes in, becomes interesting at scale. And we all know that museums are just the tip of an iceberg. I'm going to mix metaphors terribly here, but an iceberg of stuff. And while they see themselves as the guardians of culture, they're also the black holes of culture. And the extraordinary quantity of quite mundane things that they have is actually very interesting. And the British Library is a good example. And you said that earlier that they were very far ahead, but also in many respects they're not. There's huge quantities of documents that they have not digitized. And that if they did, and they were machine readable, would yield extraordinary quantities of new knowledge. And even if they were not machine readable, but they could be read by people who haven't got that much to do. And there's a lot of us around at the moment who can read cursive script, for example, and translate them. And suddenly we could interrogate them, or machines could interrogate them and find out extraordinary things we never knew before. So yes, technology definitely can create new knowledge in that respect if we turn machines to our advantage in the right way.
Sarah, do you have a view on this?
Oh, I mean, as I said before, I really believe in the humans in the loop, but what interests me about artificial intelligence is the way that it can create potentially new aesthetic frameworks for us. It's revealing, it's also knowledge we didn't know was there, but it's also a way of seeing that we don't have or haven't had until now. So it's like a peripheral vision kind of framework of looking at the world. That's what I find extraordinary. And that's where I think the creative potential for this lies, and in the public domain, and the use of large-scale data sets with machine learning and deep learning can start to create objects that we never imagined. And I think that's very exciting.
Fantastic. Now, Lizzie, another question maybe.
Yes, so we've got a few questions about questions of accuracy in data that's recorded and archived. Michael McMaster is asking, when you consider recording a museum object, say a painting or a sculpture, what information is relevant, color, texture, and size, and what traps can you fall into when recording? And then A.O. Carroll is asking, how do you address the challenges posed in a post-truth fake news culture around the use of technology and the proliferation and reproduction of material?
Wow, they're big questions, aren't they? let me just go perhaps, can I go to you, Frederick, first on the question of accuracy? I mean, the thing that always haunts, I think, museum people is quite an advanced stage of a project. You realize that in fact your classification systems might be wrong, or you've discovered that in fact what you've recorded about an object is the least interesting thing about it. Every museum in the world will admit that very often when it does digital catalogues, the one thing it's not got right is the dimensions of an object. I'm not making this up. Sometimes really basic things are not right. You must be fixated on this because you have a whole system of social networks with the Venice project based on the assumption that the underlying records and classifications actually are pretty robust.
So I think this is also a point I think that Adam has mentioned. You need to think about digitization as the beginning of the pipeline. And what you need to do is extraction of history. So there's history, I mean, of course, in text, in document, but also in any object, or even now we're currently starting some scanning of the city of Venice itself. And so the resolution, again, would you scan at the centimeter level, at the millimeter level? I mean, all that is a lot of question. And the question you should ask yourself is, what do I need in terms of history extraction? I mean, how will I be able actually to transform that image, that artifact, which has, I mean, it has a bit of a value in itself, but not a lot, I mean, my point of view. I mean, the value really will be about how that particular, let's say, small elements in a tomb in Egypt, as Adam was mentioning, will actually reveal an actual crucial element about the history of that tomb. I mean, that tomb, sorry. How much that particular crackle on the vase is actually revealing about where it has been let's say, produced. And so here there's really the need for an interdisciplinary work, which would be not in interpretation, but in understanding, like you would do for forensic, because this is about forensic. What is the resolution which is needed to extract the history of what you want to do? Of course, I mean, it's a problem because it's about evolving technology, and I think this is the most exciting element about AI, is how progressively we will develop ways of mining the reality for extracting long history, and how we will merge all these histories together to form a more or less or debatable coherent history out of it. And so, but that is the way you should think, not only in terms of display, not only in terms of preservation or reproduction, which is one way of doing it, but in terms really of history extraction, if I may. Yeah. So I'm not really answering. So it's not, but I think we should go beyond best practices or beyond general, ideology about this, and think fundamentally in the term of what could realistically be extracted now and in the next 10 years, next 20 years, next 50 years.
Can I ask you, Carol, a question about both elements of that question there, both about accuracy and also post-truth? I mean, one of the things that I found very remarkable is the more we publish digitally, the more actually we get amazing resources in terms of the world out there that actually, digital access provides its own sanity check and democratic control. I mean, have you found that actually, as long as librarians and curators can cope, actually there is a chance of increasing the hunting down of inaccuracy or bias to some degree?
Well, it depends. It depends on scale and what's really possible. On the one hand, you have a much greater diversity of content available to tell the story, but at the scale of real born digital resources. So on the one hand, and I think already the scale. You had something in your questions to us, Ian, about, is the technology beginning to exceed the sanity of curators? And the answer is absolutely yes. Just because of the sheer scale of content. So you still have folks struggling to be selective and to say, oh, look, there's this wealth of material. I can get stuff from countries I couldn't get before. There's more material, open access. But if you look at the breadth of what is born digital, you really have to look at more larger inhale techniques, and then more technological techniques for detecting the fakes, detecting the fact that, being able to do enough matching to see that that photograph wasn't the real one, and we have folks working on that. So I think it will have to be a technological solution to also a very broad collecting problem. I do want to just say one more thing about that diversity of approach. I mean, that is the other worry you see about this stuff not being found later. You have to collect it before it dissolves. And so you don't want to only be applying today's judgments on what you collect, because so you have to really shovel it in some other way. Otherwise, it will all be biased to this moment of what we thought was important as opposed to what we should have had.
Yeah, great. Lizzie, another question.
Yes, so we have a question from Sophie Laurie, who says, does the panel know the carbon footprint of, for example, a digital model? Are we at risk of producing too much data for each real world object, digital junk which uses up more energy than it's worth?
Wow, that's a great question. Yeah, Brian, give us a view.
Well, I'll just say a couple of things about that. The current carbon footprints are high. I mean, they're vastly lower than it would have been on paper and so on, but they're still enormously high. I mean, it's no accident if you look where the Facebook server farms are. They're adjacent to glaciers. They're on the boundary between Finland and Sweden and stuff. But it's dropping. It's dropping very fast. And one of the things that's interesting about Sarah's suitcase is that actually the grain of sand, the amount of the energy efficiency of DNA with respect to storing information is stupendously impressive. I actually am not sure that the energetic footprint is the real issue. I have wanted to have a conference called In Praise of the Ephemeral. I mean, my sense is that an extraordinary number of things are not worth remembering. The trick is, how do you sift and redact in the original sense of it and distill like a good whiskey? And where are those processes? And one of the things I've noticed with respect to, for example, the faculty at the University of Toronto that I was dean of for a while, is that a kind of fetishization of records was actually undermining anybody's ability to sort of sift and distill and summarize and come up with any kind of wisdom. So I think, I agree with everybody that, look, we have to remember a lot of stuff that, and with the idea that the born digital stuff is being lost and, this kind of stuff, those are real worries. But at the same time, drowning in the irrelevancies of the excruciatingly particular is also, I think, a threat to the fabric of civilization.
Carol, you mentioned earlier, the big technology companies, and we all work with them. To be fair, I think, especially in the past year, and perhaps William also has a view on this, one has seen a lot of the major companies make what I call crunchy commitments around outputs in terms of being carbon neutral. I think there has been quite a lot of progress, hasn't there? And the reason I raise that is that I suppose one of the questions for me is, can we worry about everything? So can we worry as museums and archives about the carbon efficiency of Google and Microsoft? My feeling is only partially, that actually there's a whole series of pressures on them, and that us not using their resources actually is not going to make much difference. And I think it's probably true, isn't it, Brian, that in fact the efficiency of their storage and retrieval systems are pretty impressive in recent years.
Yeah, I mean, it's bloody impressive from some points of view. The amount of energy they use is also bloody impressive from another point of view, namely enormous. But I don't think, I'm not sure that excessive concern right at the moment by, for example, those of us here or this, the heritage institutions and stuff, I'm not sure that would be the best use of their resources to actually ensure a future that is going to be worth living in. I'm agreeing with you.
Carol and then Frederick. Carol.
My reference to them was about the fact that the content that they hold is proprietary, and they quite rightly have concerns about privacy. And there are all these laws being passed about the right to be forgotten, but no laws being passed about the necessity of remembering. And so how do we balance this, and what are the arrangements that we make? I mean, when a tech company decides it's going to take down a moderated group, I don't mean because it's being bad. I mean, it's going to take down a service.
Right.
It takes it down, you know. And I mean, and there was a recent case with I think it was Yahoo groups or something like that, and you know, people lost content. It wasn't earth-shaking content. We can't worry about all content, but these folks are holding stuff that you can't really go in and save except very selectively and a certain kind of web crawl or something. And they're only holding it because it makes money for them. And they actually have much more at risk in keeping it because of these legitimate privacy issues. So what kind of partnerships might we form around the issues of preserving it was my point.
I think that's enormously important, and the demise of a commitment to open standards and the whole shifting of the platforms from open standards and public stuff to proprietary frameworks and so on and so forth. The shifting of the center of gravity of a lot of this stuff from Silicon Valley down to LA. I mean, that gets talked about in the Valley all the time. These are very serious political issues that bother me enormously. So you're absolutely right.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that mass destruction of history and memory should be at the same level as destruction of the environment. I mean, when one of these tapes is not readable anymore, when a site is blown up by a terrorist attack, when actually we are not capable anymore of retrieving a particular file, a particular document, I mean, this is really a loss for our cognitive abilities. And so this should be treated really with the same type of threat. We're still, and I can't understand really why, I mean, putting all this question about culture, history, information extraction as being a form of luxury and nice to have. I mean, it's actually absolutely essential to any cognitive elements, and so it's essential not only to our pleasure and to our world and to our aesthetic, but also to all the decision we'll make on the future. So there's really work to do on the public opinion that, of course, when there is a destruction of the environment, it's a threat to our survival. It's a threat also to our history and memory, because some species are lost forever. What they could tell us about the history of the Earth and history of life is important, but the same apply to heritage in general, and that should be put extremely clear and said loud, I think.
Fascinating. Lizzie, I think we've got time for one more question.
So we've got a question from Efe Balikcioglu about archives, and he's saying, should we be trying to amalgamate as much material as possible into a small number of digital archiving systems, or should we be encouraging the formation of multiple, perhaps idiosyncratic archives and systems? And should we be trying to standardize file formats, or should we be encouraging multiple formats?
Well, I'm going to inevitably turn to you, Carol. That's quite a big question. Standardize or let 1,000 flowers bloom seems to be that question.
So I think we need enormous diversity of perspective in archiving and collecting. I think that that's terribly important. I think archivists recognize this, that we can't have a dominant view of what is worth telling the story about. We do need open formats, and we need recognition of what preservation repositories are. And in a dream world, you'd have lots of archiving going on in lots of places, and then you'd have a set or federation of repositories that understood all the practices and requirements, and the multiple copies and the offline copies and the registries and the digit checks and all of that, where the stuff would be deposited. So that would be my dream scheme.
Fair enough. Conscious of the time, and a little joke for anyone British watching this, which is, as we approach 6:30, it's almost the law in Britain that one must have a gin and tonic on on Sunday at 6:30, which is most unkind to our colleagues who are not in Britain. But before we get to the gin and tonic time of 6:30, I wonder if I can go back to the individual members of the panel and ask you really to leave us with just a final thought about either a particular piece of technology you're most excited about, or one wise word about something to guard against, or something to inspire us. And I'm going to do it in order of those I can see in the screen. So I'm going to go first to you, Sarah, for some final thoughts on this theme.
So my final thought would really return to the structures of the museum and how in the future that these new positions that we need to create at the directorial level, at the curatorial level, are people that are heavily informed by the philosophies of the technology that we are dealing with. Because I think that this is one of its fundamental risks at the moment, is the inability to describe accurately what is going on and to envision or to create a vision for archives and for museums that are really transformative for society. And I see that as a real problem at the moment. I see a ghettoization of digital inside museums. I see an outsourcing of the knowledge that we need to third parties. And I think outsourcing, collaboration is all great, but then it also needs to be embedded into the fabric of these organizations, most certainly. And I think that that's one of its biggest challenges right now.
Your comment reminds me of a wonderful management guru years ago who once said that photocopying is a substitute for thought. And I think what he means is at the heart of your question, which is we're all under enormous pressure to collaborate, as if collaboration is in itself a good thing.
Yes.
But actually, sometimes it's a terrible thing, because it means that actually you spend all your energy on collaboration and not on some deep thinking. So it's something that certainly haunts me. Can I come to you, William?
Well, the last conversation, yes, I'm not. The last conversation made about proprietary systems made me think that museums are actually not that open themselves. And that I think, that my final thought is just relax a bit. And stop worrying about IP, stop worrying about the people out there who are going to come and mess up your data. Be generous with, be generous with the fidelity. I mean, that conversation about truth that came in, I think fidelity is a good word to use in terms of the quality of the data that we're putting out. It's not just a question of getting the date right, it's a question of enabling people to say something about what they think about the date. And it's enabling them to see the highest quality of resolution of images and thinking carefully about why you're giving this stuff out. What do I need to do to enable people to do something useful with this? So when we work with the V&A and with the senior management team there on their digital strategy, what came out was something very simple, which was all about accelerating access. Giving people the time of day when the museum opened, that sort of thing at one extreme, but at the other, opening the catalogue up and the data and making it a much richer view of all of the things that were there. In that case, using digital and making it easier to get tickets, etc., etc. It goes right the way through everything you do. So I think if people can fundamentally follow that philosophy of themselves as institutions which are there to give and not to protect, then that might be an interesting way forward.
Right, relax and be generous. And understood. Message received. Brian.
Well, I was just thinking, if you ask me to tell you about my house, I am unlikely to say I live in an electrical house. It's just assumed that there's electricity in my house. And I think for my students, describing anything as digital is about as vapid. It's of no interest to them whatsoever. And I tell them that I'm about my lifetime is going to coincide with the rise and fall of the digital. So I was born, 70 years ago. I'm going to turn 70 in a few months, and I think you can you can do the math yourself. I think it's time to have a wake for the notion of the digital.
Wow, that is a wonderfully dramatic phrase. I'm going to write that in my diary tonight. Carol, follow that one.
I can't. I think that, we're coming there. What's creating this environment is, each of us, each library, each archive, each museum answers to its constituency in many cases, because that's where the money comes from. I come from university libraries, and we have to put public libraries, the towns, and we've become, maybe not museums, but I think so in the exhibition side, wildly service-oriented, as we should be, user-oriented, service-oriented. And we need to also be able to, I think, following on the comments that William made and others, and things that you said, Ian, about what's in your storerooms, think of this kind of opening up and this kind of collecting and this kind of access as also another kind of service. And it may have to be funded in a different way, at least in universities, where it's, what are you doing for my students today? Because I need their tuition and we need to help them. So we're about to enter difficult times. We had difficult times before, and they're going to be more difficult. And how we can keep these bigger themes running and these bigger worlds of access still alive and going and working on them, even as we face those pressures, that's going to be a good challenge for us.
Also, we all need to think about what to buy Brian for his 70th birthday, which I'm already
a computer.
Yeah, I'm going to ask Sarah to create something entirely digital. But let me finish with Frederick.
Well, I think we're going to realize in the next maybe 10 or 20 years that there's a treasure of information in every artifact. And there's a treasure information in books, obviously. There's treasure information in archival records. There's a treasure information in every photo, although this is latent information that needs to be connected with others, any sound, record, and so on and so forth. And that we can call big data of the past. I mean, and I'm predicting that big data of the past will be actually more important than the 5 years, 10 years big data of the present we have. That will be important economically, culturally, that people will make better decisions based on this, that AI itself will be based on big data of the past. So if we assume that to be true, then museums and archives and libraries, they're in a very, very good position because they're sitting on the treasure, really. It's just a matter of understanding how to mine it and how to be a fundamental, let's say, player in this new data economy, which is based on the extraction of a new type of gold. That's my good wish.
At this point, can I thank the panel, and very international. We've been in Lausanne, New York, Toronto, and London. And I have so many questions which I will follow up with all of you, but you've been terrific. Can I hand back at this stage to Anna and Adam?
Thank you, Ian. I'd say, and in Madrid and Turin as well. So, because we're an hour ahead of you. Cheers, Ian. This is good. And I'd just like to say a very big thank you. That's a joke for Brian, by the way. And we can play that one out later and I'll send you the video. But I'd like to say a very, very big thank you to everyone tonight, to everyone who took part yesterday and on Friday. And particularly, I'd like to say a very big thank you to Anna and the Art newspaper for having confidence in the fact that we could actually manage to put the technology together to show Frederick live. And one of the things I wanted to say earlier is what Frederick was doing was actually searching the archive live. So that wasn't pre-prepared, it wasn't a video, that was the software running. The software's got a long way to go, the research has got a long way to go, but I hope everybody listening can feel that there's a feeling of energy and excitement, that in a world where the tweet has come to dominate, some serious discussion is actually needed to get to the nitty-gritty of what has to happen next. So Anna, thank you, and thank the Art newspaper. And of course, Ian and all the panel, thank you.
Thank you. Here, here.